In today's episode, I'll talk about two stories. In the first story of the day, I'll talk about BRICS, which is rapidly expanding in order to prepare against a little more of a divided global economy under Donald Trump's renewed protectionist stance. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about Europe's big defense push as they prepare for new security worries and changing NATO support. Welcome to the Daily Brief show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I am your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Tuesday, the 15th of April. See, with Donald Trump back in the White House and the return of the high tariff era, a group called BRICS has come into the picture quite significantly. Now, for your context, BRICS used to refer to just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but very recently it has also expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates or the UAE, and now Indonesia also as the 10th member. But even though these countries may appear very different from one another, when you look at them together in some sense, they account for over 45% of the entire world's population. They also generate more than 35% of the global GDP if you measure it by something that's called purchasing power parity, which basically tries to capture how much you can buy in each country for a given specific amount of money. What's also important is that BRICS countries produce about 30% of the entire world's oil, which means that they have a large influence on global energy supplies. Now, over time, these nations have built their own institutions like the Contingent Reserve Arrangement in 2014, which started with 100 billion US dollars, and the New Development Bank in 2015. Now, these institutions are basically meant to serve as alternatives to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which have for a very long time been guided by Western ideas and governments. So basically, by having their own funds and banks, BRICS members can trade and invest in ways that they do not always rely on, say, the United States or Europe. Also, while all these global developments are unfolding right now, researchers at the International Monetary Fund have been warning that the global economy is going through what they call geo-economic fragmentation. Now, for many years, different parts of the world became more linked through trade and investment, but now that progress is slowing down or even reversing in some cases. The IMF says that after the global financial crisis of 2008, the steady growth in the flow of goods and capital across borders began to sort of level off. We have also after that seen trade restrictions become a lot more common. But then of course came the COVID-19 pandemic and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both of which made countries worry about relying too much on foreign suppliers for crucial items. Now, according to the IMF again, if this splitting of the world economy continues even further, global GDP could drop anywhere between 0.2% and 7%. And there is also what they call technological decoupling, which is when countries stop sharing technical know-how and equipment with each other. Some nations could lose as much as 8% to 12% of their output. So therefore, because of dangers like all of this, it suddenly becomes a lot more appealing for countries to form coalitions like the BRICS. And the basic idea, as you may have figured, of course, is that if they can trade and support each other, they will obviously be less vulnerable to any other one powerful country suddenly raising tariffs or sort of cutting them off. Now, each of the original 5 BRICS members, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has their own reasons for staying in or expanding this club. Experts at the Carnegie Endowment have tried to summarize these reasons as well, and let me talk you through it very quickly. Brazil, for example, looks at BRICS as a way to boost its international standing and gain insurance of sorts if it is ever at odds with Western countries. Basically, by joining forces with countries like China and Russia, Brazil can present itself as a very key player on the global stage. Russia, for its part, is keen to show it is a part of a dynamic group of rising powers. Western sanctions have sort of pushed Russia to look for different ways of doing business and investment, which is away from any system that the United States sort of controls. BRICS basically helps Russia keep open, high-level talks with some of the biggest economies in the world, even when President Putin faces limits on travel and when Russia is under very heavy criticism from Western governments. Now, moving on, when it comes to India, we have a far more complicated perspective on this. See, we have deep ties with Russia and South Africa, but we also have a tense relationship with China. Basically, India wants to avoid letting BRICS become an outright anti-Western bloc because India prefers to keep good relations with many partners. But still, New Delhi likes how BRICS highlights India's leadership role among developing nations, which is a position that sometimes can be sort of overshadowed when India deals with the United States or China separately. Moving on, China sees BRICS as a bit of a strategic bridge, which is a way to bring together non-Western countries and sort of reshape global institutions that China feels have been too heavily influenced by the West. And with the West increasingly suspicious of China's rise, Beijing basically wants a stable access to food, energy, and other supplies, plus more freedom to be able to trade in currencies outside the US dollar. Their incentive is that the Chinese yuan could become a lot more stronger if more and more countries use it in their trade. Moving on, South Africa is aiming to amplify its own global influence by working through BRICS. They basically hope to reform big international organizations like the United Nations Security Council, and they want more funding for infrastructure. The new development bank provides a very important alternative source of capital, especially if Western lenders demand too many conditions. Now, for a while, BRICS was mostly an economic club that big emerging markets were joining so that they could be recognized and respected on the world stage. But it started to change when Russia's relationship with the West started to worsen. Russia began to think of BRICS as a tool to make global power less concentrated in the hands of the United States. China also encouraged this shift, steering BRICS to include not just economic matters, but also political and security cooperation. Now today, BRICS sits alongside China's other international projects like the Belt and Road Initiative for Infrastructure and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Security and Regional Stability. Anyway, the expansion of the BRICS membership is one more sign that this group is now evolving very quickly. Bringing in Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, UAE, and even Indonesia introduces a whole new set of perspectives and priorities for them. Egypt, for example, has been struggling with a shortage of dollars and is very keen to do more trade using local currencies. Ethiopia, on the other hand, hopes that membership will help it build infrastructure and deal with climate challenges. Moving on, Indonesia's foreign policy is all about staying free and not sort of locking itself into one single alliance. So joining BRICS is like a part of a larger plan for them to keep all their doors open. And a country like Iran looks at the BRICS very differently because for a long time it has pushed the United States out of the Middle East and weakened Washington's power. For Iran, basically, BRICS is like almost the perfect way to reduce its economic isolation. But that said, the UAE says that it is not really joining BRICS to go against the West, which is very interesting. They basically want to stay open to all sides, and BRICS membership simply gives them more partners for trade and investment. So even these new members have very different goals if you think about it, and they all seem to agree that they need a hedge or an extra insurance against a world order that has become much less predictable than it once used to be. But despite being under one BRICS label, all of these countries still have plenty of differences. China and India, for example, remain very wary of each other, and Brazil has worried that opening BRICS to more members would reduce its special access to Chinese president and increase China's and Russia's clout within this entire group. South Africa has a mixture of close ties and suspicions as well. It is friendly with China and Russia, but it also keeps lines open to the West, even if it often criticizes Western influence. Now, during the talks over whether to add new members or not, India and Brazil here were relatively hesitant, but China and Russia were pushing hard for expansion. According to the Carnegie report that I mentioned, Chinese-Russian collusion very quickly overwhelmed Indian and Brazilian difference. There is also the debate over whether BRICS should really try to reduce the usage of the US dollar on a larger scale or not. Russia and Iran are keen for sure because sanctions made it very hard for them to do business in US dollars. But India, on the other hand, thinks a bold push for single BRICS currency or a big move away from the dollar could create more problems than it actually solves, especially if it harms India's relations with countries outside BRICS. So all of these tensions put together mean that BRICS might sound very united, yet it must deal with clashing interests inside this group. But still, the fact that Donald Trump is imposing a lot of tariffs now could push BRICS members even closer because they might feel the need to protect themselves from any unfriendly US policies. So in the end, BRICS is both a reflection of a world that is sort of splitting apart in some ways and like a force that could sort of speed up that entire process because it gives countries an alternative place to cooperate without having to rely on the West. On that note, let's move on and talk about the second story of the day. See, many analysts today believe that Europe is in its most fragile security situation ever since the Cold War. Now, the reason of this is a mix of concerning events that have all together come at once for them. Russia's war in Ukraine has been going on for many years with almost no signs of stopping, and that by itself is already a huge strain on Europe's sense of safety. But that said, what truly alarmed European leaders was a big shift in American policy under President Donald Trump's administration, which has been far less supportive of Ukraine than they had imagined. Now, there was a disturbing scene at the White House where President Trump and Vice President Vance openly humiliated President Zelensky, making it very clear that Ukraine could no longer rely on the kind of US backing that it had in the past. But it's not just about Ukraine though. Europe has also been rattled by Trump's repeated questioning of NATO, which almost suggests that Europe should manage its own security on its own. Now, a think tank put it very interestingly. They said Trump only responds to deals and strength, which basically means that he is not prepared to defend Europe by default at all. Now, some European officials have even used the phrase security emergency in order to describe their situation. Meanwhile, Europe's intelligence agencies are fearful that Russia might take about 5 years to build back enough military power to threaten NATO territory directly at all. And that 5-year window has become a driving force of sorts behind Europe's new plans to strengthen its militaries. For a long time, European countries kept their defense spending low because they could rely on the United States. But now they're realizing they need to spend a lot more money and very fast in order to stand on their own feet. Interestingly, these decisions are not just about defending Europe as well. When governments spend hundreds of billions of euros on defense, it affects global markets. India's defense industry, for example, could find new opportunities by exporting to Europe or forming partnerships with European contractors who suddenly have very big budgets. And to understand how powerful these plans are, we can look at the work of a respected European think tank called Bruegel. Now, their research shows just how huge the planned spending might be. The European Commission president has announced a program called Rearm Europe, which aims to raise roughly 800 billion euros. And to put that into perspective for you, that is about 10 times India's defense budget. Now, this plan has several layers. One major piece is to activate what are called escape clauses in Europe's budget rules. Normally, each European Union country has to keep its government deficit below 3% of its total economic output and gradually reduce its public debt if it is above 60% of GDP. Now, if they do not follow these rules, they can face penalties. But escape clauses give countries the option to temporarily spend more without really being punished. The National Escape Clause is especially relevant here because the EU Commission is arguing that the current security emergency counts as an exceptional circumstance. And by invoking this clause, countries can increase their defense spending by up to 1.5% of GDP over 4 years without facing any penalties. Now, this could of course free up about 650 billion euros for them to invest in their militaries. There is also a 150 billion euro lending facility called Security Action for Europe or SAFE in order to provide loans to member states for their very defense needs. But that said, there is a huge gap between what European NATO members currently spend and the new higher tariffs that they have set. See, until recently, the NATO standard was 2% of GDP spent on defense, but now European countries aim to reach 3.7%. And that 1.7% increase is actually enormous for many countries. And to give you context, only Poland is above 3.7% right now. Some countries like Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, Portugal, Slovenia, and Spain, for instance, would have to raise their defense spending by more than 2% of their GDP just to hit the new goal. And when you add all of that up, European NATO members would need to spend another 275 billion euros every single year in order to meet their new target. And to give you a comparison point for Russia, they are believed to spend around 120 billion euros a year on military, which itself is a big chunk of their national budget. And also, the money that Europe spends will need to fix quite a few serious shortcomings. A recent white paper for European Defense Readiness 2030 identified 7 important capability gaps, which range from air and missile defense to drones, from cyber capabilities to the infrastructure that helps move troops very quickly. There is also a push to include Ukraine in Europe's defense industry projects, at least in principle, but the European Union has not created a specific source of funding for Ukraine. So while that is definitely a part of the conversation, it still does not have its own dedicated budget line in all these new measures. And the financial side of this spending plan can get complicated because of Europe's strict fiscal rules. It might be simpler if the European Union used something called the General Escape Clause, which applies when the entire European economy is in bad shape, like during a major recession, for example. But that said, that general clause does not fit the situation right now because this crisis is about security, not an economic downturn. Instead, the European Union has to use the National Escape Clause, which requires each individual country to step forward and declare its own special circumstances. And that can carry a stigma if people think it signals financial weakness. So to avoid that, the Commission has asked all member states to do it together so that no single country looks bad on its own. But that said, not every country will require the clause. Some with low debt like Germany or the Netherlands can already boost their defense budgets without really going over the 3% deficit limit. Others, such as Italy, France and Belgium, already have high deficits or debts which might really need that extra leeway that the escape clause provides. Now, the Commission wants to keep that extra spending under 1.5% of GDP, but many experts, including those at Bruegel, wonder if that limit could actually be enforced. Then there is also an important question about whether all of this new spending will be coordinated or not. Now, so far, the plan involves mostly national borrowing rather than a big shared EU fund. The safe loans do come from a common pool, but they are still loans at the end of the day and not grants, and each country has to apply them individually. This means that every nation can very easily go in its own way now, where they can develop their own tanks, missiles, or fighter jets instead of working together for more efficient outcomes. The Center for European Reform has noted that neither the escape clause nor the safe loans have been designed in a way that would strongly push countries to collaborate. Some might decide that cooperation is too messy and choose to buy or build equipment on their own basically. Anyway, there's also the question of whether these countries with the highest debts will actually risk borrowing even more for defense or not. Italy and Spain, for example, already have large debt burdens and they might worry about how voters would really react to such heavy military spending. Some signs suggest that they are also uneasy about the language of rearm Europe, which they feel sounds way too militaristic. And Germany's latest decisions bring one more layer to the complexity of this entire picture. See, Germany used to be famously strict about government borrowing following a debt break that made it extremely difficult to run deficits. But the new German government has pushed through a reform that permanently exempts defense spending from its debt break. Germany also announced a gigantic 10 trillion euro infrastructure fund, showing it is prepared to borrow big for certain priorities. And while Germany can handle this financially in itself, this change might shake the foundations of Europe's rule-based fiscal framework. Germany for a very long time has been the champion of tight budget rules, so some analysts see this as a sign that the European Union's established system could start to splinter of sorts. According to a researcher named Pench, who was cited in Bruegel's paper, Germany's approach upends the rule-based system in the euro area. Now, this might put the European Central Bank under more pressure to help manage bonds markets if countries with less financial wiggle room start seeing their borrowing costs spike up. See, at the surface, Europe is about to undertake the largest rearmament program ever since the Cold War ended, which is driven by a new view of security threats in this entire region. But behind all of these big numbers and figures are a lot of details about how every single country's economy will handle this added borrowing, whether they will coordinate or compete in building military equipment, and whether countries deep in debt will actually follow this entire thing. Now, this plan shows how seriously Europe is taking the possibility that Russia might be a direct threat in 5 years, but of course 5 years is not much time to reinvent the entire continent's military strength, especially when it requires so much money and so much cooperation. So for investors who are looking at defense sectors worldwide, there is a bit of a potential for growth over here because European budgets might open doors for international firms, including those in India. But that said, there are still major uncertainties here. There are questions around whether European countries will truly spend the sums that they have announced, or will political disagreements slow things down over here. Now, there's also questions around whether new weapons, technologies and infrastructure will be built by European countries alone, or will they also rely on partnerships from outside Europe. And of course, finally, there is also the question of how the financial markets will react when more and more governments start to borrow to pay for this massive project. That brings us to the end of the two stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, Adani Enterprises is set to launch its Kutch copper smelter, which is India's largest, within the next 4 weeks. The facility recently began producing its first anodes as part of its phase 1 commissioning. This comes at a time when global treatment and refining charges have turned negative, pushing Asian smelters into losses due to tight copper concentrate supply. Once fully operational, the smelter is expected to reduce India's dependence on imported refined copper, especially after the 2018 shutdown of the sterile plant, which once supplied 40% of domestic refined copper. Second, Apple has shipped around 15 lakh iPhones weighing around 600 tons from India to the US using chartered cargo flights in response to the recent tariff hike on Chinese smartphones. The exported phones, which were primarily high-end models like the iPhone 16 Pro Max, were manufactured at Foxconn's Chennai plant, which produced 2 crore iPhones last year and is now operating on Sundays to meet a 20% higher production target. Third, Airbus has announced its plans to increase its annual sourcing from India to $2 billion by 2030, marking a nearly 43% jump from current levels. In 2024, this aerospace giant sourced $1.4 billion worth of components from India, which is a 40% rise compared to the previous year. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I know this was a bit of a heavy episode, but I hope you learned something new. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.